Our next speaker is Dr. Erin Smith, the Associate Professor of Disaster and Emergency Response at the School of Medical and Health Sciences at ECU. Dr. Smith is visiting us today from Victoria. Dr. Smith's presentation is named Supporting Volunteer Firefighter Wellbeing, Lessons from the Black Summer Bushfires. And it presents research into the impact on first responders. They are uncovered some startling psychological trauma that remains long after the crisis subsides. Some of you people in the room probably understand that already. Welcome, Doctor. Welcome to Bunbury.
Thank you so much, Chris.
And you've got the just afternoon gig.
Fantastic. How are you all? I wish I could be there with you all in WA. I'm sure it's a much nicer day there than it is here in Melbourne. It's quite grey and horrible, and we're in to about our 100th day of lockdown here, so we're all starting to feel it a little bit here. If I could start my slides, please. I'm not sure if you guys can see them at that end. I'm not sure if they're already on the screen. I'm assuming they are. So this research project I'm going to talk to you about today really came about from some personal experience and lived experience to start off with, and that really motivated me to think more broadly about the impact that volunteering during emergencies and disasters has on our mental health and our wellbeing. So if I can take you all back to the beginning of January last year, and I know it's hard for us to remember anything prior to COVID at the moment, but I remember we just finished Christmas, our family Christmas, and I had just started volunteering with the Red Cross here in Victoria as part of their emergency services response team. And we were all put on alert because these fires, particularly across the eastern part of Victoria, were really starting to take off, and it was really becoming more and more worrying each day. And I remember watching on TV, as I'm sure many of you did as well, those graphic images of the horrendous bushfires, those unprecedented bushfires taking hold across so much of our country. And I was actually activated with my very first activation or deployment with the Red Cross as a volunteer during those bushfires. And my role was to be doing some psychological first aid with all of the evacuees that were coming back from Malakuta. So I'm not sure if any of you were involved with this response or remember it. I graphically remember those images of people huddling on beaches in Malakuta to protect themselves from the onslaught of those fires, and then getting on Navy ships being brought into Melbourne and then onto hotels and other places for them to evacuate to, because so many of them had lost their homes. And even though I wasn't activated to the actual site of the bushfires, just witnessing the sheer impact that was written all over the faces of the evacuees as they arrived on those Navy ships into Melbourne, and trying to help them figure out where they were going to go next and what was their next step, it really impacted me a lot more than I actually thought it would. And it wasn't even necessarily in the immediate aftermath of that, and when we'd gone home and days went by, and some of the traumatic stories that I heard and some of the things that I witnessed over those days helping those evacuees really started to play on me. And as those fires kept progressing and then COVID occurred, and we just had all these stories coming through of those that were responding on the front line. And I personally just kept thinking, wow, is that one little exposure that I had, that one little part of my volunteer experience had such an impact on my mental health and wellbeing? How on earth are those that were right on the front line experiencing this for days, if not weeks or months on end, how on earth are they coping with all of this? And when we reached the 12-month sort of mark anniversary after the Black Saturday bushfires, I started to reach out to some of the responders that I knew that had been involved in that response to say, hey, I'm really interested in having a chat to you to see how you're going 12 months on. Because I knew from my own experience, I was still having nightmares and thinking back to some of those horrible things that I had seen and heard and witnessed 12 months ago. And I was just a volunteer in an evacuation centre. I certainly wasn't right there in the middle of it. I didn't have a threat to my life. I didn't have a threat to my community. I didn't lose my home or have damaged property. So my colleagues at Edith Cowan University, which was Dr. Lisa Holmes, Bridget Larkin and Dr. Brennan Mills, and my friend and colleague from New South Wales Fire Service, Mark Dobson, started to put together a research project where we wanted to start talking to a few volunteer firefighters about their experiences on the front line, what the impact that had had on them, and particularly how they would better like to have their mental health and wellbeing supported in future disasters such as Black Summer. So that's where this project really started out. Next slide, please, Dean. So throughout sort of the first part of this year, we started talking to some volunteer firefighters who had responded to Black Summer, and we ended up having 54 responders or volunteer firefighters. The majority of them were from Victoria and New South Wales, who reached out to us to say that they really wanted to be involved in our research because they wanted to share their experiences, particularly the impact that these experiences had had on their mental health and wellbeing, and how that impact had been supported by their respective organisations. And that's sort of where this project started out. So as I said, we decided to do interviews, so qualitative interviews with all of these responders, which in itself was a huge undertaking, very emotional, but so richly rewarding and descriptive. And the objective of the research that we really set out to do was to explore the impact of those Black Summer bushfires on volunteer firefighters and to investigate how to deliver effective wellbeing support, all based on their lived experience. So what had actually happened to them and what they felt would have probably better supported them after those bushfires. So as I mentioned, we ended up interviewing 54 volunteer firefighters, and all of them, without fail, within those interviews, and most of these interviews took about an hour to do, all of them voluntarily reported that they had been impacted by what they saw, some of the traumatic events they had to deal with, particularly those who reported dealing with maybe one or more actual traumatic events within that fire season seem to have been more impacted, which makes sense, particularly the more we're learning now about cumulative exposure to disasters and events like that. When we started digging down into those interviews, and really we transcribed them all and pulled out all of the data that came out of those, and some of the results we found were actually quite alarming. So we found that around 1/3 of the participants we had interviewed had felt like their life had actually been threatened while they were responding to bushfires. So that's an incredibly traumatic experience in itself. And then about 1/4 of them had experienced at least one traumatic event that had really affected their wellbeing. So a one-off event within that overall response. And some of these people had been responding for days, weeks and months, but they could really pinpoint one or two events within that time that had really affected their wellbeing more than others. For some, it was going into their own local communities and witnessing the sheer devastation. For some, it was the fact that they couldn't save their mate's house down the road. Others lost or had their own property damaged, had animals killed. Some lost their mates. It was really varied, but obviously the more of those individual traumatic events that they witnessed within or experienced within that time frame, the more they experienced, the more impact that they had. But at least 1/4 of the people that we spoke to had at least one traumatic event. The rest had a lot more than that as well. 50 of our 54 participants self-reported that they had a need for wellbeing support, and subsequently 12 had gone on to be diagnosed with PTSD. Really sadly, and these were really raw, emotional interviews at times, both of us, the interviewers sat down and really cried when we actually conducted some of these interviews and listened back to them, because 3 of those responders very bravely told us about the plans that they had actually put in place for their suicide. So some of them had been so heavily impacted by what they witnessed and hadn't been supported appropriately, to the point that they had planned out their own suicide, but thankfully hadn't, for various reasons, followed through with that. Perhaps the finding that most concerned us, though, was that the participants had not received any kind of mental health treatment or support in the 12 months following the fires. So pretty much everyone that we spoke to when they had self-reported the impact that this had had on their wellbeing and the mental health impact that they had experienced. When we went on to gently ask them about, well, did you seek support? Did you receive support? Have you had treatment for that? Overwhelmingly, the answer was no. And that was really quite concerning, but it certainly echoed results of research that I've done over the past 15 years with firefighters and first responders from the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And even 10 and 15 years down the track after that disaster, many of the first responders that I spoke to still, even though they self-recognised their wellbeing had been impacted and that their mental health had certainly deteriorated, they still hadn't gone out to seek support. And probably even more importantly, no one from their organisation or support networks have reached into them to say, hey, listen, we think that you're struggling and we think that you need some help. But what was also really concerning with this project and this cohort was that about 3/4 of the responders that we spoke to identified that they had actually never been contacted on an individual one-on-one basis by their organisations after Black Summer to see how they were going. So many of them reported that maybe they got a bulk email that was sent out to everybody in their organisation saying, here's the number for the EAP if you need to have a chat. Give them a call. And then it was kind of like, that's it. You know, organisations have met their duty of looking after wellbeing. And quite a few of our responders were really angry about this and said, when I'm really struggling and in crisis, the last thing I'm going to do is ring some number and speak to some stranger who has no idea what it's like to go through what I have been through. And that's something that we've certainly heard in quite a few other research projects with responders as well, is that they don't like utilising the EAPs or the employee assistance programs because they know, as well-intentioned as they are, and that they do play a significant role in a comprehensive, holistic wellbeing program. On their own, they are not enough to support people because most of the time the people taking the calls are not adequately trained in understanding and responding to those complex challenges and needs that people who've witnessed these kind of horrific events need help with. So that was really quite interesting. And only 10% of our participants believed that their wellbeing support that they had received was actually appropriate, and none of our 54 firefighters that we spoke to felt like they had received enough support or the right type of support that would actually suit them and help them improve their mental health and wellbeing. So it's actually really quite interesting too. I just wanted to note before I move on to the next slide, thanks Dean, that these findings actually echo those from some research that was led over there in WA from the University of Western Australia. Not that I should be mentioning the competitor, but we won't say that. But they actually did a big national research project that's been published recently, and their report was called After the Fires. And so if you're interested in this sort of topic area, I really encourage you to have a look at that report as well. But what we found, and obviously we've done ours on a much smaller scale, we've taken the time to really sit down and interview and chat to these people one-on-one. Their project is on a lot larger scale, but interestingly, we found the same kinds of problems. So when you get repeated results that are the same from different studies, they're telling you that this is a real problem and we're onto something here. So what do these responders, or what did the responders in our cohort actually want in regard to their wellbeing support? So we found when we went through all of the hours and hours of data that we had collected, and we went through all of those interview transcripts and information that they had provided, there were 4 key things that really stood out to us. The first was the need for any effective wellbeing support program to be both proactive and reactive. And I'm sure if there are any first responders in the room who are listening now, you'll agree that a lot of the times the wellbeing support that is provided from emergency service organisations has traditionally been quite reactive. Something happens and we provide some kind of support to those who have responded. But what came through loud and clear in our research was the real need to, yes, have that. Obviously, we need reactive support for our mental health and wellbeing, but we also need to be proactive. You know, some people suggested that, hey, I think that just like we might need to have routine physical health checkups, that maybe it's a really great idea to have a routine mental health checkup. And I always love to quote Tony Walker, the CEO of Ambulance Victoria here, where he talks quite openly about routinely getting his checkup from the neck up. And quite a few of the responders actually said, I'd be quite willing to do that, to engage in proactive kind of support to help build resilience and identify some really great coping strategies so that when the shit did hit the fan, sorry, shouldn't have said that, they were prepared for it and they had strategies in place and they knew people that they could reach out to. I know when I've been in crisis and I've needed to have some mental health support, the last thing I want to do is reach out to somebody who has no idea about my history, who doesn't know me, where there's no rapport and you basically have to start from the very beginning. It always works better when you have a pre-existing relationship in place so that when you are struggling, it makes it much easier to reach out to people and have a chat. The other things that really came out of that in terms of we need to be able to reach in and reach out, but it was also around this need to really empower people in these organisations to do this. So it's not enough for us just to sit here and look in at an organisation and say, you're failing, you're not doing a good enough job. We really need to provide the education and the resources and the support to actually empower people to feel confident enough to reach in when they need to. The second clear thing that came out was that, as I mentioned, these employee assistance programs on their own aren't enough. That if that's the only thing that an organisation has in place to protect mental health and wellbeing, it's not going to support people because the majority of our responders don't like to utilise that kind of support. The third clear finding was how important the sharing of lived experience was. And this came out in many stories around peer support and many of the responders sharing with us that some of the best support they received after the bushfires didn't come from their mental health professionals, didn't come from the organisations, but came from the chats they had with their mates, the ones that had shared experience, had been through something similar. So we can't underestimate the impact that sharing that lived experience can have. So I think moving forward, we really need to identify ways, again, that we can utilise this sharing of lived experience in a type of peer support program or format. And it needs to be done at the local level as well as at the organisational level. So we need to be empowering those that are out there in communities and we certainly saw this was a challenge with COVID, for example, that the peer support guys weren't actually classed as essential services. So despite the fact that they knew so many of their colleagues were struggling, they couldn't physically go and sit down face to face with them and have a yarn. And they said, sure, chatting on the phone helps. And even some of those who did have access to a computer at that time managed to do some kind of Skyping. But they all said that face-to-face aspect, and when you actually trust that person that you're talking to and you can feel vulnerable around them and really have an honest and open conversation, that is so important for supporting wellbeing. And the final thing that came through loud and clear was this real feeling amongst the responders that there was a need to build understanding and mental health literacy amongst the leaders of the emergency service organisations. So again, it's not so much a negative thing in terms of saying you're doing a crap job. It was more about we need to provide resources and empower these leaders to be in a position where they confidently feel like they can recognise people who are struggling, reach out to them or reach into them, and then have really safe and effective conversations around mental health. So that's really important. Next slide, please, Dino. So the majority of our participants, surprisingly, didn't feel supported at all when it came to their wellbeing, and seeking help was still identified as a really problematic issue amongst this group. And again, it's something that I have seen for the past couple of decades amongst first responders and particularly firefighters. There's a huge amount of self-stigmatisation still happening, and this was certainly identified back in 2018 when Beyond Blue did their national Answering the Call research survey, where there was 20,000 emergency service personnel and volunteers from around Australia took part in that research project. And what was really loud and clear from those findings as well is that we're not really stigmatising each other. We're not judging each other for mental health and wellbeing, but we're doing it to ourselves. We're self-stigmatising and we're telling ourselves that we're weak and that suck it up, that how on earth can I have a problem? I didn't lose my house. I didn't die. I didn't lose a loved one. So how on earth can I be affected by this? We really need to tackle that self-stigmatisation. And I think a lot of that comes down to still, you know, we've done a huge amount of work and we are progressing a lot within this space, but it's still around normalising conversations around mental health so that it isn't a taboo topic at all. And look, it's still really clear that there's still almost among many of these fire service almost this toxic masculinity when it comes to the culture there. So we've still got some way to go in terms of changing the culture as well, so that people know that it is okay to speak up. And part of this is around, as I mentioned before, empowering and teaching the leaders how to speak up and talk about their own lived experience, opening up lines of communication and trust, building those pre-existing relationships so that when our volunteers are struggling, they feel like they are very comfortable and confident in starting those conversations. And I really liked actually our previous speaker who I just came in at the end of, and the acronym that he was speaking to about helping other possibilities emerge or having hope. And I love that. And I think I might even pinch that as well and say that I think that was something that seriously came out of our research, was that we need to look at how we can help things evolve now. Instead of just identifying the problems, we need to look for the possibilities of how we can overcome that. And my final slide, please, Dean. So I think, you know, we still obviously have some work to do in this space, but I know I've been doing research and working with first responders for the better part of 2 decades now, and I know we've absolutely come a huge way. We've broken down a lot of the stigma. We're getting much better at having conversations around mental health. We're building mental health literacy within many of our emergency service organisations, but there are still some issues with the culture, with the self-stigmatisation. And I think we also need to really be aware of the fact that it isn't a one-size-fits-all answer here, that to really support mental health and wellbeing of our volunteers, we need to provide a range of resources and support systems that best suit their needs. So some should be face-to-face, some should be online by telephone, some might be anonymous, but others might be peer support. Some might be locally led peer support groups or online peer support groups, and some might be organisational level peer support. There's a need for all of this, and we need this holistic approach to really be able to make any kind of real advancement and change occur. So I think my final message to everybody who's listening today is that it's all around empowering people, empowering those in local communities and their organisations to feel more confident about talking about mental health, empowering those who are out on the ground to feel brave enough to talk about their mental health. And one of my colleagues, Mark Thomas, who is the president of the Code 9 Foundation, a charity here in Victoria that's set up to support first responders who have mental health challenges that have arisen from the work they do in the community. And he always says it's not weak to speak. And I think that goes a long way as well to saying, yes, sometimes the organisations need to make change, but we as individuals also need to as well. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, and thank you very much for listening today.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. A lot to think about for us emergency responders. Are there any questions of Dr. Smith, please? We have the microphone, if you may.
My name's Robin. I was just wondering whether you found any particular local government group or anyone that is doing it well or better than, you know, leaps and bounds ahead of anyone else that other people could learn from.
Yeah, so we purposely didn't ask the responders which organisation they were from, because that was actually something we took quite seriously in terms of when we were inviting people to participate. We were told quite unequivocally by a lot of people that if this was officially through their service organisations, that we wouldn't get people signing up because the fear of, that if they speak out, that there would be some kind of retribution for that almost. So we wanted people to be able to speak anonymously, to really open up and share their experiences. So while I don't have specific organisations or LGAs to share with you, I think the things that really stood out were those organisations who took a very proactive approach to supporting wellbeing, and that certainly came across from a couple of the people that were involved in this, in that, yes, they had had an impact to their mental health and wellbeing, but they felt that their particular organisation had been quite proactive and provided a holistic range of services that they could reach out to. But in this instance, COVID really had impacted on that as well. So as I mentioned, some of the peer support teams, for example, and some of the people that used to go out with the peer support and their dogs, go out and chat to stations and individuals, that couldn't really happen because when we were all locked down, the peer supporters weren't actually classed as essential services or essential workers. And so that message came through loud and clear, is that needs to change, and that we need to consider these kind of mental health providers as mental health professionals, and that they should be essential and should be allowed to go out, because it was that face-to-face contact and communication that was so beneficial, and that sharing of lived experience.
Thank you for that question. Any others? There's another one coming. Thank you.
Julian. Yep, there we are. Hello, Erin. My name's Julian. Really good talk, particularly around the stigma and those sorts of things. I'm a local bushfire chief for a local government, and I'm also the emergency services supervisor for a mining company. And what I've sort of found in the past is that with the stigma, workers involved in a critical incident on site will also often be volunteers with fire and rescue or bushfire brigades or St John's ambulance, and they're more comfortable to go and talk to those peer support groups and counsellors than they are our own site EAP, and then vice versa in the emergency services volunteering. They're quite happy to talk to their work EAP because they don't want that organisation finding out about it or that they've sought help. And in some cases, they'll actually foot the bill themselves and go and see the GP and get a referral. Is that something that's common across what you've discovered and what you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was something that certainly came across as a very prevalent issue, was that those that had reached out and sought support, the majority of them weren't doing it through their organisation. So they had actually gone, as you mentioned, to either their GP, or they had personally identified their own mental health professional or sought peer support through other organisations rather than going through their organisation. And when I sort of queried why that was, a lot of it came down to the fact that they didn't trust that if they shared that they weren't coping, or that if they were struggling, that wouldn't be then used against them in almost a way of, and I know this certainly came through with the research I've done with 9/11 and also more broadly with police responders as well. And it's almost that analogy, if you take my gun, then my job's gone and I can't speak out because you'll take my gun. With the firefighters, it was almost like there was this real feeling of, if I'm not coping, then I don't have what it takes to be a firefighter. So again, this real feeling and a culture of masculinity was coming through as well. And I must admit, for any of the ladies there in the audience, it was us females that were more likely to put our hand up and say we needed support and to actively seek that out. And that was certainly the case also with all of the first responders that I worked with after the 9/11 terrorist attack. So it's certainly a prevalent theme in that you men aren't quite as good as coming forward and supporting your own mental health. And it is that stigma that's still attached to it. And again, I don't really think there's actual stigma and judgment and bullying so much around mental health occurring. It's more, again, that self-stigmatisation that we do to ourselves. And if I actually say, yes, I'm not coping, will they then take me out of the role? Will that mean that they won't let me be a volunteer anymore? And as we know, those of us that volunteer, it's a huge part of our life and our identity. So the threat of, or even just the perceived threat of that identity being removed from us, so many of us will sit back and not speak about mental health. We'll just let it go.
Thank you. Any other questions? I've got a couple of virtual ones here. You won the prize of the most questions today.
Hey.
The first one is Is there any printed material to support the work that you're doing that people could use as reference, please?
Absolutely. So this particular project that I've spoken about today is actually just about to be submitted to the journal Pre-Hospital and Disaster Medicine. So that will hopefully be available as a peer-reviewed publication in that journal in the coming months. But I also highly recommend that you have a look at that report that came out from the University of Western Australia and their collaborating researchers, which was after the fires. And they actually looked at what we did, but on a much larger scale. From memory, it was some 4,000 responders or emergency service personnel. So it wasn't just the volunteers that they looked at. They looked at the paid career responders as well. But it was quite striking when we sat down and looked at our results and compared them to theirs, that these issues were quite similar. So I would really, really recommend that people have a look at that paper as well. And that's available freely online as a PDF.
Right, we'll put the link to that on the Emergency Data webpage. Thank you very much. Another question, if I may. Despite reassurance, many volunteers fear using EAP for fear of being stood down. I think that's pretty much what you covered. How do they overcome this, do you think?
Yeah, it's difficult because I have to put my hand up and say I'm not a fan of EAPs. And when I have had my own wellbeing issues, whether it's been after responding to disasters or just the research that I do and the vicarious trauma that I've experienced, I've never really felt comfortable enough to reach out to an EAP. But I think we really need to, that's where it comes back to this whole idea of having a suite of programs and resources in place that people can access. And so I know one of the examples that I hold up as a gold standard here in Australia is Ambulance Victoria and the way they approach mental health and wellbeing support. They have a really varied array of support systems in place. So if you want to speak to a chaplain, chaplains are available. If you want to speak to a psychologist, there are psychologists. If you want to speak to a peer support member, there's peer support teams. If you want to actually speak to the EAPs there, they're building up resilience with so many other things that they're working on at the moment as well. And I think, you're not going to stop people from feeling uncomfortable calling an EAP. So you need to provide other options for them so that they don't see that that's their only option and then just say, okay, well, I tried. It's not worth it.
Right, thanks very much. Any other questions finally? There's another. Please stand to the microphone. Cleaning up.
Hi Erin, my name's Louise Stokes, Recovery Coordinator for Local Government, but I'm also a Red Cross volunteer and a Volunteer Brigade member. What I've seen is that the Red Cross do an amazing job with their volunteer wellbeing program post-incident. And my question is, have you seen programs in place either within Australia or internationally where government or agencies work across their own organisation and support each other to provide those services? And I suppose the ambulance would be a great example, as if they work with local government or if they work with state government and volunteer brigades in helping.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not sure if you guys can hear me, but I've lost you. That cut out about halfway through that question. I apologise.
So my question is, have you seen nationally or internationally where agencies who do a great job in welfare support post-incident come and actually assist other organisations or local governments or state government in either sharing templates or running a fee-for-service or running a program themselves?
Wonderful question. And unfortunately, no, I have certainly not seen that for us to share lessons that we're learning across different organisations. And certainly a lot of the lessons that we learn in one emergency service or volunteer role will certainly translate and be transferable across to other organisations. But I think that from my experience within emergency services particularly, we still tend to operate quite in silos and there isn't a huge amount of sharing happening. One example I can highlight is some work that's happening here in Victoria at the moment that's been funded by WorkSafe and being led by the Emergency Services Foundation. And they've actually brought together leaders from every emergency service organisation and key volunteer organisations as well. And they've brought together, it's about been 60 odd leaders that have come together to complete with a pilot program that we've developed and I've been teaching into called Leading for Better Mental Health. And a big part of that is sharing lived experience, sharing lessons across the organisations, really breaking down those barriers and silos to say this works for us, well, this works for us. Maybe we can share some ideas here or even collaborate. So I think we're slowly moving in the right direction, but to date, I haven't seen any widespread sharing, and I would love to know if anyone else out there has some examples. It would be great to see what's happening.
Thank you very much for your time. We're out of time. Please join me in thanking Dr. Smith.